When winter comes a-knocking, sometimes, the cold really takes you by surprise. More than all the blankets and comforters in the world, sometimes the right kind of winter recipe can help you more than anything else. Today, we're going through some forgotten ones that were perfect for warming people up. So, suet is pretty much just the raw and hard fat that you can find around the kidneys and loins of cows, but basically, boiled suet pudding was one of the nicest things to make in the winter. The reason for this was pretty much just that it was one of the most filling dishes you could have. Suet was never really anyone's first preference for anything. I'll be honest, it was hard, chewy, and it was a little too metallic tasting, and that did not do any kind of favors for the dish. Sweet pudding was always something that was really helped by the ingredients around it: the parsley and the thyme, the dried fruit, and the lovely texture of the dish itself. When it's winter and you have nothing to eat, and the heater isn't exactly having its best moment, this is one of those dishes that you can find yourself relying on without worrying. Suet puddings were some of the first instances of awful food being popularized as an option, and for some, even a tasty one. Plus, what most people don't know is that sweet has a pretty high melting point, so you could heat this up to high heaven and take it out so it doesn't lose a lot of its warmth in the winter. I know you've heard of all kinds of pies in your lifetime. We have our meat pies, we have fruit pies, hell, in the Depression. We have had pies without any kind of eggs or flour in them. Parsnip pie is still something that took me for a spin because what do you actually mean it's a pie consisting entirely of just parsnip? The savory root vegetable flavor is definitely a good accompaniment to any dish, but did we need to make an entire pie out of it? Now, some people say the dish tastes great when you pair it with the right kind of vegetables like leeks and carrots so that it balances out the flavor. Other people say that it's even more bitter than pumpkin pie, and it's just a hard pass for them. A lot of folks also hold the opinion that parsnip pie is just a lot more like a casserole than any kind of pie. So if you've had this, my question to you is, what is this actually like? And did you like it? So we're really going back to the 90s with this one, specifically the very early start of then. No, I'm not talking about just the Depression or just the World Wars. I mean cabbage and sausages, and how this has been the national obsession of people, especially during winter for the better part of a century. Seriously, cabbage is a wonderful vegetable. Did you know that? The thing works with noodles, eggs, gelatin, and now sausages, and it does that pretty damn good. Did you think it couldn't? How else do you think people make those sandwiches work? See, most people also had space for growing their own cabbage if they were living in rural areas or had come from farming-oriented families. But in the 90s, a lot of people in urban settings had that too, thanks to how many folks had to grow victory gardens. Now, sausages were always cheap, abundant, and readily accessible, so it wasn't a wonder that this simple pairing of the two became something that everybody desperately needed and could not get enough of. You might not have heard of Clabber before, and it does definitely sound like a draft concept for a chowder episode, but this is just soured milk that's really been put through the ringer. It gets thickened, curdled, and after some serious fermenting, it essentially manages to become a custard-like milk with a thick consistency. I guess you could call it a cultured dairy product, but historically it's always been used as a leavening agent. I mean, you might not know that before baking powder became the top dog in everyone's pantries, it was Clabber. But that begs the question, how do you actually create this curious concoction? Well, it couldn't be simpler. All you take is some raw milk, right? And then you let that sit at a pretty specific temperature. The rest is nature doing the work for you. The humidity of this lets the bacteria ferment the milk, and it just keeps thickening until you get the end product. It's not really all that good, though, so I can get why people forgot about this one. Sorry, Clabber, you just couldn't make the cut. Rabbit pie is another thing that's been extremely popular throughout winter and most of the decades of the 20th century, but it's something that's really just faded in the 21st. Back then, people used to really hunt for rabbits, you know? It was normal, it was typical, it was in a father-son bonding thing if you went to the right part of America. Before that, it didn't used to be something that was just a hunting pastime. It was a genuine protein that people were living off of. Families that lived in the outskirts of town would hunt rabbit for meat all the time, and making a pie out of it was one of the best ways to keep yourself warm, fed, and energized throughout winter. Then you have the rich folk who have a pretty tight chokehold on rabbit and rabbit hunting, what with their country clubs and dozens of hunting lodges across the country. In the 21st century, though, things took a turn, and rabbits were something people would much rather have as a pet than go out to eat. While some restaurants, especially gourmet ones, do still serve the thing, the pie is something you'd rarely find on anyone's table in winter now. Haggis is essentially a Scottish dish that's also the country's national food, so you can imagine who brought this one over to America. It's just a savory pudding that's made entirely from your usual affair of organ meats that people in America aren't really used to at all. Offal's a funny thing, and we have a funnier relationship with it. We'll eat everything, even fish eggs, because some rich guy made caviar a thing. But God forbid we start to touch a liver, right? Anyway, haggis was something you made by taking the offal of the sheep and throwing that in with oatmeal, onions, spice, and a lot more. Here's the low-key grotesque part, though, and the one where I really get why people didn't like this. Typically, you prepare this using sheep's stomach. I'm going to give you a minute to think about what that means because it's not what you think. They didn't use the stomach as an ingredient, they used it as a casing. Yes, the dish was made inside the sheep's stomach, and though modern versions try to get around this by giving us synthetic casings, it's just not really the same. But hey, back when it was popular, you couldn't have a Burns night or a winter Saturday without it. Thank God it's not anymore, though. Whether you want to Louisiana and the Gulf Coast, or whether you were visiting some family in New England, you absolutely could not escape salted cod stew, and the best part was that wherever you went, you would get a remarkably different tasting dish at the end of it. In the southern parts of the United States of America, you would get salted cod stew that had okra or file powder in it, which made it resemble gumbo. And this was all because of the influence of Creole cuisine. In New England, it was the total opposite. You had a salted cod stew that was a lot more similar to a chowder, but instead with a cream base made from milk. Salt cod stew was something that lasted fishing communities through many kinds of winters because, well, stews have obviously already been a timeless winter go-to for a lot of people, and there's just nothing better than fresh fish to warm you up and energize you. A lot of people would also build the broth by adding tomatoes, white wine, stock, onions, garlic, or even hard-boiled eggs. So the goal here really was to make this as much of a heavy hitter as possible to get through those winter nights, and it did a pretty good job of that. See, you have pretty much the exact same state of affairs for boiled beef and carrots. It's just something that you would think would never go away as a winter classic, and a lot of families had traditions centered around this dish and others like it. So why does it end up on a list of poor old forgotten winter recipes? Well, we might be dusting this one after a pretty extended stay in the attic, but that doesn't mean this dish didn't get its time in the spotlight. For centuries, boiling beef was something that transcended cultural, class, and racial divisions in the country, and was just one of the few things that was always enjoyed by everybody, no matter what. It was less of a summer thing, but as soon as winters would kick around, oh boy, people would get their biggest pots out and start making the stew. It's been something that people were doing from the days of cowboys racing through the frontier to all kinds of folks from all over the world visiting in the 2070s. But hey, everyone and everything changes, and the American palate of modern times is a lot more oriented towards lighter and easier to make meals. Boiling beef takes time, slicing all those vegetables is work, stirring the whole thing is work, and a slow cooker helps, but nowadays there's just a lot more convenient options. Stews in general are something I think have gone out of style with the modern crowd, but what do you think? Homemade head cheese is a pretty good use of cold-cut terrine, which is essentially just taken and made from the head of a pig, and it's sometimes slow-cooked just until the meat is tender enough to fall apart in your mouth firstly, and secondly, so that the natural gelatin that those pig bones release sets the dish. What it gets set into is a pretty nice loaf that's firm but not tough, a little hard on the exterior but not chewy, and just something that's really absorbed all the different flavors of onions, garlic, bay lanes, peppercorns, and everything else people used to throw into it. Homemade head cheese was literally just meat jelly, by the way. It was a savory gelatin dish, and the closest thing you could call it would be an imitation of an aspic dish. There's actually no cheese here. Sorry to disappoint you. I know you were looking forward to it. But hey, What I can tell you is that they used an entire pig's head for this. And I really do mean the entire head. The ears, tongue, and snout were all things that were used in the dish thanks to the collagen they stored in the bones and the connective tissues. So steamed date pudding is this really moist and rich dessert that takes almost no work to make and has the potential to be your savior this year when the temperature gets a bit too close to zero for comfort. You just steam a batter which is made by slicing and chopping dates, softening them in some water, and then throwing in some baking soda so all that gets broken down nice and easy. Then, you just steam this batter until you get a dish that has an almost cake-like consistency to it. It's something that people have always been massive fans of as far as wintry comfort food is considered, and in the early 20th century in American home cooking, this was particularly one of the more standout recipes in the Midwest and New England. See, it's something that's so inherently British, so naturally the first places this dish found for itself were communities with densely packed populations of British people. Now, the pudding itself is pretty sweet, but it's the steamed aspect of it that makes it one of the best things to have, not just during winter, but when you have a cold too. So hey, here's to some pretty versatile date pudding. When you hear the word lutefisk, your brain might go immediately towards some kind of fish you would only find in rivers and seas rarely, maybe around fall, maybe not at all. What it actually is this Scandinavian dish that's made from whitefish, which often really is just cod. But the trick is the fish has been rehydrated in a specific solution. This special concoction is called a lye mix, and it has to be soaked and treated in this for around 2 to 3 days before it's ready to eat. At the end of this, it gets a gelatinous texture, and the fishy taste of the meat has largely been overpowered by now. Once you take it out of the lye, you rinse it in fresh water for just as many days, all to remove the dye, because if you eat it as it is after its extended dip in the lye tank, you're likely to end up going to the hospital on a night where it's 2 degrees. Then, lutefisk could either be boiled, steamed, or baked, but it had to be handled real carefully because it had a good chance of just crumbling on you. The next thing you would do with this was serve it alongside boiled potatoes, peas, bacon, and mustard sauce, and this was really the most popular combination in Norwegian-American communities. It used to be survival food for Scandinavian settlers too, and the reason why is because dry fish actually lasts you an incredibly long time throughout the winters. Nowadays, some people in states like Minnesota, Wisconsin, and North Dakota, where old, nostalgic upper Midwest culture still thrives, may serve it, but you wouldn't lutefisk even at church dinners anymore. Now, peas pudding is this ultra-thick and smooth dish that's been made entirely out of yellow split peas that have to be boiled and mashed. On this list, the kinds of things you will most often see is just stuff that's been boiled or steamed over and over because that really does make for the best kind of winter food. This would be served as a side typically because it wasn't filling enough to work as a standalone main course, but it could make a killer sandwich filling. The dish was something that had a really nutty flavor and a creamy texture to it. It was something that people often began to describe as being similar to hummus, but with an almost heavier consistency. You would just soak the peas overnight and then boil them in broth alongside something like salted pork or a ham hock so that you could throw in some flavor in there. Once that was done and the peas were all nice and soft, then you'd get to mashing them together, and sometimes people reduce the moisture further by cooking it for a little while. The idea was to get a long-lasting thick paste, you know? Then you had your basic seasonings. In medieval England, this dish was a wondrous hit among the working class, and it seems they brought all that tradition and history back with them when they migrated and settled to northeastern parts of America. Winter squash and barley stew is something that's a really hearty and rustic dish. It's the kind of recipe that would bring back memories of better and nicer days for your grandma, and it's something that any person who was alive through the harsh winters of the 90s would remember. Here, you get to simmering chunks of squash, right? But the trick is to just throw in some barley in a nicely seasoned broth. The squash just consisted of pantry typicals like butternut, Hubbard squash, or acorn, and this would be peeled and seeded before people cut it into cubes. The idea of cutting it into cubes came from packaged cubed chicken stocks you could buy, and most people thought it was a better way to give some flavor throughout the broth. Next, you sautéed some aromatics, started building the broth, got to work on the barley, and just left it for simmering. The finishing touches were some mushrooms and smoked meat, but it worked fine enough on its own too. Barley's always been a staple grain in America's history, and that's true for more than just the Appalachian and Northeast regions. Winter squash was reliable, you could store it for a while, you could depend on it to last, and it was a natural growing product. Now, goose with chestnut stuffing is a dish that can go a couple different ways. The one we're talking about today is a decadent, old-fashioned dish that's traditionally always reserved for big celebrations, occasions, and other memorable days. Things like Christmas, your best pal Dave's wedding, Brian's baby shower, things like that. Goose has a flavor that runs a lot deeper than most different kinds of meat, even turkey or chicken. It has a lot higher fat in it than most other meats, so that means it gets to stay moisturized for a lot longer too, even when roasted. One of the biggest issues people ran into throughout the winter was that the dryness of the season was already affecting their food, but when they'd get to roasting or steaming it, the food would only get drier and harder to eat. That wasn't an issue with this because roasted geese were really juicy. The stuffing on the inside also helped, and the chestnut that people would chop, peel, and roast on top of the sautéed onions and celery made for the perfect wintry meal. If your kind of winter food is creamy, subtle flavors that incorporate a lot of natural ingredients, then Salsify soup is what you need in your life. It's made from salsify, which is a root vegetable that people sometimes affectionately refer to as oyster plant. But that's just because it tastes suspiciously close to an oyster. I mean, where else would you get that brine from? The delicate soup is also something that people often compare to its contemporaries. You have your usual potato or, as we recently discussed, parsnip soup, but people thought that Salsify soup was unique because of that intense earthiness in it. The roots for this were scrubbed and peeled, although some people like to include the outer skin too, believing it had medicinal benefits. Then, the roots would be cut into pieces before being soaked in a lot of lemon water. Onions, leeks, and other vegetables that had been sautéed in butter or garlic were thrown in just to give it a bit more of a flavor profile, and then the soup would just be left to a broth, which was a mix of chicken and vegetables and then cooked until tender. You really had to let this one simmer, though some people preferred to throw in some milk and cream throughout the process just to add a bit of a more velvety texture to it. It was a great soup that didn't last at all towards the end of the 20th century, but even if you go back to some 19th century cookbooks, you'll find loads of references to Salsify soup. Pork and apple hot pot is, and I'll bet money on this guarantee, something you will not at all be able to guess no matter how lucky or smart you think you are. See, when I say hot pot, I don't mean the hot pot we all go for with our friends, but with apples thrown in. I mean a layered casserole. Bet you didn't see that one coming, huh? Well, basically, what people would do here is that they would slow cook the pork alongside the apples and onions and potatoes, and then they would also be baked together. You can imagine what going through so much together can do for people, so just think about what it does for all these ingredients. That flavor gets sealed, and not even a lockpicking team filled with history's best could get through this one. The pork shoulders were something that took a while to get used to for people, but once they saw the benefits of cooking with other parts of the animal as well, then they realized stuff like this marked some amazing winter food. Sadly, though, it was limited only to people that had access to ovens, and if you didn't, you couldn't get to enjoy a casserole like this, which is sad because I think on this list it's the first casserole we've talked about. And now I'm thinking about everyone that had to wait till March to get one. If you thought we were done with Suet, then you were wrong, my friend. If you thought we were done with apples too, you're still wrong. This time, we have both in the form of baked apples with Suet, which is as old-fashioned as it gets. This was a time where people were considering stuffing whole apples with all sorts of fillings, and for some reason known only to God and themselves, they thought Suet was the perfect thing to go in there. See, when people start justifying things like this, they'll always throw in words like, "Oh, the richness," or, "But David, it's so juicy and soft. How could you not like it?" And see, to that, I say that those are textures. And a dish, first of all, needs to taste good before it feels good to eat. Baked apples with Suet had one department covered, but were falling dangerously low on the other one, and preparing the apples was no joke either. You had to use large and sturdy apples like Northern Spy or Rome, but they would be cored and left whole. Then, the chopped sweet would be mixed with a lot of warm spices, some dried fruit and brown sugar, and then baked in water or cider for a while before they'd eventually be served with cream and molasses or custard. Butter became something that was really available later on throughout the later centuries, which isn't something people are really aware of. Before then, what people used as a baking fat instead was always suet, and this dish was a 19th century classic. Homemade mincemeat is something that's a really rich mixture of different kinds of dried fruits, spices, some sugar and suet, and just a little bit of rum or brandy. The very modern versions of this dish are all still meatless, but then they aren't really the same dish we're talking about, are they? Traditional homemade mincemeat contained a lot of chopped beef and venison that had been diced to the moon and back, and what it would do was create the perfect kind of filling for pies and tarts. Suet was really chopped, grated, and apples were always cored and peeled for their sweetness. Raisins, citrus peels, and currants would be thrown in, and a lot of these ingredients were either just things that were out growing in the wild or available for dirt cheap at any grocery store next to you, so no one had trouble sourcing the stuff they needed to get cooking. Some versions of the dish did include a bit of a financial barrier with chopped and ground beef, which wasn't always affordable to everyone, but the good thing was you could substitute it for whatever kind of meat you had available, or just have it with suet. What people would do to make things more interesting is throw in brandy or rum that had been stored in jars for as long as a few months to give it an intensely deep flavor, and man, I can't tell you what that does for a dish. It's like if you could give steroids. Black pudding stew is a dish that people make by simmering different kinds of slices of black pudding, which is really just blood sausage, then mixing all of that in with vegetables and potatoes. A lot of people would throw in pinto and kidney beans, and in soul food circles, black-eyed peas were really popular. You would saute aromatics and throw in things like onions and leeks or garlic which had been softened in butter, and if that wasn't available, you could always use lard. Some people just used lard anyway because it gave a more meaty flavor. A stock base like beef and pork was added, and you had your typical assortment of herbs. Black pudding was something that people added right at the end because otherwise it would break apart, and that's also why these vegetables were left to simmer for a while before so that the stew would overall thicken. People thought it had an incredibly iron-rich flavor, which was a draw for some and a massive turnoff for others. But what about you? Is black pudding stew sounding like something you'd cozy up with throughout the lonely winters? Or are you going to stick with your usual rice bowls and soups? Cabbage rolls with buckwheat were a rib-sticking dish that got incredibly popular in Eastern European immigrant communities throughout a majority of places in America. I'm talking about mostly areas like the Upper Midwest, Dakota, Appalachia, Detroit, and Pennsylvania, and just about anywhere that you would see farmhouses set up. The cabbage was something people cut no corners with because, yeah, you really did boil and steam an entire cabbage head until the leaves were just tender enough to actually roll. Next came the buckwheat, and people would toast that, then cook it in a broth with some garlic and mushrooms for a bit of an umami kick. See, everything that's considered good winter food spends a bath in a broth, because what you absolutely don't want to be doing during winter is wasting gas you could be using for fire sand heating on cooking food for like 15 minutes longer so it gets flavor. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but add that up every day or every other day, and for a lot of families it begins to mean something. That's why this broth worked so well, because it took almost nothing to make and you could just leave it there and chill while you went about the rest of your day. Then, once the filling was prepared, you had to spoon it into cabbage leaves that had to then be rolled up really tight. These were rolls that had been placed in a baking dish and had mushroom sauce thrown in for even more flavor, and I gotta say, they worked really well. Shepherd's pie with leftover mutton is a winter comfort dish that's been a tale as old as time. Actually, it's not even just winter. People have just been enjoying shepherd's pie in general throughout the year. It's still something people make today, but it's not something people rely on through the winter. And a lot of that, believe it or not, has to do with convenience food culture and technology. See, why would you rather waste time cooking up the filling, making the gravy, making that mashed potato topping, and assembling and baking the whole thing for some warmth on a wintry night when you can just turn on the heater and order something like, I don't know, PHO or something? There are so many gourmet options available to people these days that home cooking in general has gone out of style. But the ones that do often either spend their ingredients and money wisely, because let's be real, you seen rent these days? Or they go all out on fancy social media-oriented dishes that have the real potential to go viral. Somewhere in between all that, there's really little room left for shepherd's pie, which most people consider a nostalgic and old dish with a lot of rustic charm, but it just doesn't click with the way most people like to eat now. It's still great for winters, though, and your mom will make a killer one anytime you ask. Rye porridge is a wholesome and hearty breakfast that's made from rye flour or cracked rye, and it's something that is simmered into a really creamy consistency. This porridge is renowned for having, the nuttiest flavor ever for a porridge, and it was something that you would see in Scandinavian communities, German dense cities, and farmsteads in the South all the time. The beauty of cracked rye is that you could really play around with the consistency. A lot of people talk about what they like to eat taste-wise, but not a lot of people pay attention to the fact that food is just as much of a sensory experience as it is a flavor one. With rye, you could create a consistency that would fit just about everyone's preferences, so if somebody liked theirs extra thick or a little more on the runny side, then you could definitely cater to that. Hey, that might seem small, but try convincing 3 kids to eat porridge and then watching them argue about how it's not the right kind of texture. What this basically does is give moms a great option to rely on, and it's perfect for winter because typically you serve it with warm milk, maple syrup, honey drizzle, all things that keep your health up and keep you going strong throughout the winter. Plus, it's pretty cheap. Baked turnip gratin is a dish that's really comforting because it takes these turnips that have been sliced and baked in a really cheesy and creamy sauce, so, that's already a standout. Turnips aren't something that a lot of people are too familiar with, but they have an incredible amount of potential, and one look at this dish will have you investing stocks into them. See, for the gratin sauce, people would use cream, butter, and garlic along with Parmesan or Gruyere cheese. All of that together would make for something that was incredibly rich and thick, with a lot of people seeing the sauce felt like lasagna that had been taken fresh out of the oven, and then you had the layers of turnips that had been arranged ever so carefully in a buttered baking dish. It was a creamy sauce that had been poured over the top with cheese sprinkled for a little bit more of a wow factor, but again, this was a dish that would only work if you had an oven. It was popular in areas where root vegetables were not really easily grown, but hey, they had to get their greens in somehow, right? Homemade scrumpy. What does that really sound like? Is it baby food? Is it dog food? Is it sick food? It's actually just a very traditional and rough farmhouse-esque hard cider that originates from England but was brought on over to America back when settlers was still a common word. It became extremely popular with places that were known for growing apples like the Appalachian foothills, and scrumpy was known for being funky and strong, but not in a bad way, more in like a standout way. That doesn't really help make it sound any better, does it? Anyway, traditional scrumpy is something that's made from a mix of cider apples which are known for being bitter. What people would typically use is stuff like Kingston Black or Yarlington Mill, but a lot of people thought nothing beat an apple you got out in the wild. Once you crushed those and got the juice out, then you would just throw it in with the tarts and start to make scrumpy. It was a pretty light and easy dish, and out of everything here I think it's got the most potential to make a comeback, maybe under a different name though. If you were going on over to your grandparents for a casual Christmas or Thanksgiving visit, you may have been surprised to find that the dinner table was anything but casual, with delicacies like squash casserole. Creamy, crunchy, and filled with cheddar cheese and crackers, it is an all-time favorite that has been a staple of holidays and birthdays in many households. It was more popular to correctly reflect past tense in the 20th century, which explains why you would usually only find your grandparents making it, and back then, it would be very common to have this at potlucks. Some households still have it at theirs, but the trend has taken a bit of nosedive with the cracker and cheese combo taking a bit of a backseat. That only goes for if you are ordering a squash casserole from a restaurant though, because from the hands of any American granny, it was a dish impossible to resist. To start off, home-style lamb casserole was a staple back in the day. What's not to love about tender pieces of lamb slow-cooked with root vegetables like carrots, potatoes, and parsnips in a rich, savory broth? Different versions of this casserole were often flavored with a blend of herbs such as rosemary, thyme, and bay leaves. This hot meal was a hit in the 1900s, especially in the colder months. Now, lamb casserole was not just about sustenance, it was about bringing the family together. It wasn't easy to whip up, so you really had to get your hands dirty and put in the work. Parents and grandparents would pass down their secret recipes and techniques, so the aroma of this hot meal never really left our dinner tables during winter holidays like Christmas. Unfortunately, tradition was trumped by convenience, and this lamb casserole has been pushed aside for quicker, less time-consuming options. So, beef barley soup has a really rich history, and you can see that in the way it lights up a room once you serve it. The dish is simple, but its strong points come from how nutritious all the ingredients are. This makes it one of the best comfort foods to have in the winter season, especially since it makes sure you keep hitting your protein goals in a season where the blanket just makes working out too hard. Funnily enough, protein wasn't even used to be a part of the equation. For the longest time, this soup was just something that was made with barley for military troops because it was easy to make, pass around, and carry. People do lots of different stuff with beef barley soup. Besides just being the perfect family dinner during the cold season, people also add in extra toppings like mushrooms, herbs, and aromatics to enhance the flavor and vibe. Shrimp gumbo is a warm, spicy staple from Louisiana, an unforgettable blend of French, Spanish, and West African influences topped with that unmistakable Cajun twist. It all begins with a roux, a rich, nutty base of flour and fat cooked to a deep brown. Here's the trick. The darker the roux, the deeper the flavor, but there's no speeding through this step. It takes patience, a bit of muscle, and a careful watch to get it just right. Once that roux is perfection, in go plump shrimp, smoky sausage, and the Cajun holy trinity, onions, bell peppers, and celery. Add okra for thickness and a hint of earthiness, and then bring on the heat with Cajun spices. Let it all simmer, melding together into a bowl of pure comfort. The finishing touch? Filet powder, a special edition made from dried sassafras leaves, gives the gumbo a gentle, herbal warmth. In Louisiana, gumbo isn't simply a dish, it's a celebration. There's even an annual festival in its honor, showcasing the endless ways families and chefs put their spin on this classic. And one thing's for sure, nobody makes just a little gumbo. Serve it with rice and a crusty piece of French bread to soak up every last drop. And as they say down south, laissez les bon temps rouler. Burgoo may sound like something you would shout in a difficult situation, but this is in fact the everything stew of Kentucky, which has an interesting history. Settlers used whatever ground meat and vegetables were available in their kitchens in the preparation of this dish. If you were a pioneer in the wilderness, that meant wild game. Think squirrel, rabbit, and even raccoon. Most burgoos served today are made from beef, pork, and chicken, cooked with corn, lima beans, okra, and tomatoes. Burgoo is known for its intense, slightly smoky taste and thick, stew-like texture, which can be attained by slow cooking for approximately 24 HRs. Burgoo is taken with utmost seriousness in Kentucky. However, burgoo was the first festival food that was simmered in large kettles over burning coals and was offered to church gatherings, fairs, and political meetings. It was said that a great burgoo could feed a whole town, and today, some places still make it in 100-gallon kettles, stirring with paddle-sized spoons. There is even a Kentucky Burgoo Festival where different cooks prepare and offer out the best-tasting burgoo. As expected by this enduring tradition, no two burgoo recipes are the same. Therefore, if you have never tasted burgoo, get a recipe and allow the stew pot to do its magic. Remember, it will take time. This is not a dinner that you can prepare in the blink of an eye. It is an experience. Speaking of cheddar cheese and nostalgic family meals, we cannot go without mentioning the ever-timeless King Ranch chicken casserole. This is definitely a dish for those people who feel like casseroles without meat or protein of any kind are missing something and do not feel as fulfilling. It would take about an hour to cook, but this did massive numbers in every neighborhood from Detroit to Texas. Especially more so in the South, it was a common practice for families to preserve their King Ranch chicken casserole recipes. The real strength of the dish was that you could use as much of the ingredients as you wanted, letting you double or even triple the dish, an advantage that Southern grandmas would very often use when they were in the mood to dote on their grandkids. Lamb shank and barley soup is another winter favorite that seems to have disappeared from our modern menus. Think fall-off-the-bone lamb shanks simmered in a flavorful broth with barley, fresh vegetables, and aromatic herbs. Barley added a nutty texture and made the soup even more filling. Sounds pretty good, right? Well, this soup was all the rave back in the day. Also known as the Scotch broth, it originated in Scotland in the early 19th century and made its way around to other countries in Europe. This soup was perfect for cold days as it wasn't only comforting and delicious, but was also packed with nutrients. Since it was light on the pocket, the lamb shank and barley soup were prepared in large batches and enjoyed by families for several days. It had a long shelf life too. What more could anyone want? With the rise of pre-packed and instant soups, this labor-intensive meal has fallen out of flavor. But if you're ever craving this winter meal, there are millions of recipes all over the internet. As far as soup classics go, it's really hard to beat tomato basil soup. It is the perfect blend of traditional American taste palettes mixed with Mediterranean-inspired dishes that really saw a rise in the middle of the 20th century. It is sophisticated enough that you would think you had a proper meal, different from your usual routine. The kind of thing that once you eat, it feels like it really added some variety to your day. The rise of tomato basil soup as a middle-class icon is kind of representative of those shifts in culture I was talking about during the 20th century. Really, though, it wasn't until these times that soups like this became a big thing. It wasn't really just that they were this foreign dish and recipe, a new way of trying the same old things, or just something they'd never heard of entirely. The thing here this time was the rise of comfort foods, convenience culture giving us an endless supply of canned products, and lots of American laziness, which basically had people cutting corners wherever they could all the time to speed up the cooking process. Brunswick stew is both heartwarming and mysterious. Its true origins are still a matter of debate. Brunswick County, Virginia, and Brunswick County, Georgia, claim to be the birthplace of this tomato-rich stew, which dates back to the 19th century. Regardless of its origin, Brunswick stew has always been about using local, seasonal ingredients and stretching them to feed a crowd. Traditional recipes used wild animals such as squirrels or rabbits, but nowadays chicken and pork are the usual protein pick for this stew. The stew is thickened with crushed tomatoes, chicken, and lima seeds, sometimes adding a little barbecue sauce for an extra smokiness. Long ago, this dish was a communal affair, made in massive pots and often cooked over a wood fire for hours until every ingredient was melt-in-your-mouth tender. In Brunswick, Georgia, there's a 25-gallon cast iron pot that claims to be the original Brunswick stew pot. It's big enough to feed an entire town. Southerners have been known to argue over whose Brunswick stew is best, with each family passing down their own secret recipe. But whether you're making it for a crowd or just stocking up in the freezer, Brunswick stew will fill your kitchen with the scent of comfort and nostalgia. Now, mashed potatoes and gravy need no introduction or explanation. Everyone and their mother's mother has had it. But did you know how good they were at making it? Receiving this dish from the chefs of generations ago was an entirely different experience in comfort. We do not know what spices they would mix, as each area had its own variations, with some even using mushrooms. Most popular was coriander, thyme, black pepper, and some oregano. The gravy would even put KFC to shame, if we are being completely honest. You just did not feel like eating from the outside when you had such fine dining available at home, and it was the perfect thing to get you back up only our feet from an exhausting day. So high pie is a traditional dish from the 17th century that might sound intimidating, but it's actually delicious and surprisingly easy to make. If you're ever feeling like whipping a fancy meal on a cold snow day, high pie is your best friend. If high pie doesn't ring a bell, you might know it as raised pie. Strike a note? This unique pie was made using a hot water crust pastry, which allowed the pie to be formed by hand into a high, sturdy shape. But here's the twist. Instead of a pastry crust, it's topped with a layer of mashed potatoes. The best part? It can be filled with anything from ground beef and vegetables to braised chicken. High pies were often reserved for special occasions or holidays, as they required significant time and effort to prepare. The hype for high pie has died down over time, but it's still a staple in some homes who can't seem to let it go, especially during the winter months. Lentil soup originated its career during the Great Depression in America. It was instrumental in giving middle-class families a shot at affordable nutrition. But for everyone who was living below that standard of life or the poverty line, it was pretty much what their bodies were made up of. Lentils are one of the oldest cultivated crops in the world, and there's even evidence that people as far back as the Egyptians have used it. Nowadays, you genuinely don't see too much of the stuff anymore. I mean, in today's world of colorful, trendy, and overstimulating processed food, an organic and plain soup like this really wouldn't last. It is still quite a popular thing in Indian American and Southeast Asian communities, as both those places share cultures that they've brought on over from their homelands. Now, lentils are really affordable, but they're also really versatile. You can make these in a cream of mushroom soup or even throw in some chunks of protein, and it'll still work. Cioppino is the ultimate coastal comfort food, a steaming bowl of seafood goodness in a tomato and wine broth that practically transports you to the Pacific coast. This Italian-American stew originated with San Francisco's Italian fishermen who'd throw together whatever the sea offered up that day, whether it was crab, clams, mussels, shrimp, or fish. The magic of Cioppino is in its flexibility. No hard rules here, just a satisfying mix of the freshest seafood around. The base is a flavorful blend of garlic, onions, tomatoes, and wine, simmered down to a rich, aromatic broth. Add in a touch of fennel for sweetness, a sprinkle of fresh basil, and some red pepper flakes for heat, and let each piece of seafood cook just until tender. Traditionally, Cioppino is served with a hearty loaf of sourdough bread. After all, no one wants to leave even a drop of that amazing broth behind. And here's a little fun fact for you. The name Cioppino comes from the Italian word ciupan, which means little soup, though there's nothing little about the big, bold flavors in this dish. One spoonful, and you'll feel like you're catching a salty ocean breeze right off the San Francisco docks. Perfect for seafood lovers or anyone wanting to wow with a new recipe, this stew will steal the spotlight. Pair it with a crisp glass of white wine to complete the experience and savor a taste of the California coast. No travel required. Southern skillet cornbread has been a beloved memento of the South for many decades to the rest of the nation, but in the area, it is a tradition that goes back all the way to the 18th century. History books tell us that it comes from Native American cuisine, and it makes sense since a lot of Native American cuisine was very cost-effective. It is kind of everything you would want in a home-cooked meal, easy on the wallet, simple ingredients you can find at any nearby store, and little prep time, which means you can get your cravings fulfilled immediately. Plus, most cooks back then were so accustomed to it from a lifetime of making cornbread in these cast-iron skillets that they could make it much faster than even an experienced cook. Guess experience counts for something, especially when you have 40 to 50 years of it, right? The chicken and leek casserole is a celebration of classic French comfort food. But don't credit the French for this delicious meal just yet. This casserole is actually a variation of the Scottish cock-a-leekie soup. It's also known as Scotland's national soup. Think of a casserole that combined tender pieces of chicken with the delicate flavor of leeks, all cooked together in a creamy sauce. The original recipe added prunes during cooking, and traditionalists still garnish with a julienne of prunes. Back in the day, it was perfect for feeding big crowds. Plus, a touch of white wine or Dijon mustard makes the creamy sauce 100 times better. It's surprisingly easy to whip up, which makes it a great weeknight dinner option that's sure to become a family favorite again. You can really impress the family table with this unique casserole. Who doesn't want the whole fam to rave about their cooking skills during the holidays? Go earn your points. Butternut squash soup is actually a pretty neat little relic. It came from the family of winter squashes, which was a tradition kept alive for centuries by Native Americans. It was eventually one of the crops, alongside beans and corn, that made Native American diet and culture. This was for many reasons. This squash was really easy to store, it was easy to migrate, and it was really just a perfect winter soup. When European settlers finally did arrive, one of the first things they appropriated was the many recipes and cooking traditions of America. They added things like pumpkin and butternut to what was originally just squash soup. As Americans explored more global cultures and experimented with what they could do. Personally, I think it's all right, and I can see why flavors like butternut are so out of style right now. That's definitely something people only associate in a dessert context, and soups couldn't be further from all that. Pepper pot stew is also known as the soup that won the war and has lots of spice, history, and tradition as well. Its origins were in the Caribbean, but it was embraced by African, Native, and Creole chefs who came to Philadelphia during the Revolution. It is stated that due to pepper pot stew, George Washington's soldiers were able to survive the winter they had ahead of them, which makes this dish a part of legends in American cooking. Tripe-based with hefty vegetables and hot peppers as the main ingredient, pepper pot stew is still spicy and peppery even to this date. This stew is hearty and comforting, and really has a full range of flavor profiles with deep, meaty tones complemented by the freshness of hot peppers. Allspice or thyme will give the stew warmth, while potatoes and dumplings make the stew richer and ensure that every drop of the broth is consumed. This food was originally sold on the streets of Philadelphia in the 1800s as pepper pot stew, cooked in steaming carts. It became so popular that even the city of Philadelphia earned the nickname of Pepper Pot City. While tripe is not as typical in contemporary renditions, this is a well-liked and distinctive dish. Give it a go to add some historic touch to the winter meals. Pepper pot stew is not just a meal, it is history, put into a bowl, garnished with spices that will give your tongue a good telling off. Pot roasts have been as much a part of the grand scheme of American culture and cuisine as anything else on this dish, and each area, state, and neighborhood has their own ideas of what one should look like. Were you the kind of kid that grew up on beef chuck roast, potatoes, a beefy broth, and carrots in your roast? Maybe you had boneless chuck roast, olive oil, bay leaves, and stuff like that instead. These are just the few variations you can expect to find when it comes to a good, well-done pot roast. The perfect party snack or a great one to pull out for an incredibly large family dinner with the in-laws and extended family, this is one dish that never fails to pull through, especially when a seasoned cook is behind it. Remember the slow cooker oxtail stew Grandma used to make during the holidays? Yeah, it wasn't everyone's cup of tea, but if you love oxtail, this is a winter dish straight out of your dreams. The invention of slow cookers in the 1970s made this dish a global hit, as you could make it without the need for constant attention. The oxtail is a cut of meat that requires longer to cook than you can imagine, and I'm sure you can connect the dots to why this one vanished from our dinner tables. Who has hours to spend on a stew nowadays? Well, if you ever find yourself stuck at home with nothing to do, the slow cooker oxtail stew won't only steal away your boredom, but also satisfy all those meat cravings. You just need the meat and then some vegetables like carrots, potatoes, and celery before cooking it all in a deeply flavored broth. Red wine or tomato-based stew both work wonders. This one will stick to your ribs and keep you warm on a cold winter night. Minestrone soup actually started out as something that was a vintage ancient Roman heritage dish, and it was supposed to be a very basic, bare-bones type of vegetable stew. This common meal utilized local ingredients that were available, like lentils, grains, and garlic. The word minestrone is actually something that comes from the Italian word minestra, which means soup. However, this particular phrasing of the word refers to a pretty large soup. That ties into how it was prepared and perceived, since minestrone soups were almost always made for working-class families, so that a big batch of food could be prepared and served to everyone. Conveniently eliminate dinner problems for the day, add some nutrition into everyone's diet, and do it all on a budget with no real work? It sounded like a home chef's dream, and it definitely was. Minestrone soup became a symbol of Italian-American heritage, especially with how many of them were bringing their own family recipes and including other things like macaroni and kidney beans. In ancient times, people would use very simple pulses and ingredients because all that was available, but in the 70s and 80s, the nutritional appeal and the availability of all kinds of different ingredients meant that minestrone soup saw a comeback. However, in this attempt to add flavor and variety to it, people pretty much diluted the original recipe to the point you couldn't really call it minestrone soup anymore, and I think that's why it's a forgotten classic. Every spoonful of Irish lamb stew is like the warm embrace of the Emerald Isle. This signature stew is simple yet soulful. It uses just a few ingredients: lamb, potatoes, onions, and carrots, although it's perfect for a warm winter's night. But the Irish tend to do it year-round, especially on cold and foggy days when you need something hearty to cut through the cold. The star here is, of course, the lamb, which is so tender it's almost melting. But don't overlook the potatoes. They're not just sidekicks. It thickens the soup and gives the stew a smooth texture. During the Great Famine in Ireland, lamb stew was made from almost anything available. And this authentic Irish lamb stew never used any fancy flour or thickeners, just the natural starch of the potatoes, and it was delicious. You'll know it's done when you can't resist the smell. To raise the bar to the next level, add fresh herbs like thyme or parsley, and serve with Irish soda bread to soak up every drop of soup. This stew is as straightforward as it is satisfying, proving that you don't need a lot of ingredients for something truly delicious. It's simple, durable, and just waiting for you to warm it up. A lot of the recipes from the times of our parents come from the Depression and from when America was recovering from it, but things like baked ziti is what they would whip up when they had a bit of money in their pocket. Some cooked ziti, ricotta cheese, eggs, and spaghetti sauce meant for an incredibly easy and amazing pasta. If you had the Parmesan to spare, you could also sprinkle it on or add a melted layer as a topping. It did not take too long to make, and it tasted very different from regular pasta or spaghetti and meatballs, which was a recipe favored by moms more than grandmas. The real highlight of the dish is in the shape of the ziti, since they end up being these 25 to 30 centimeter tubes. When they turn into soft pasta, they become great for chewing and work really well with the cheese. Grandmas would always spice it up with some beef or duck here and there, though. Now, skirt steak might seem like a grilling cut, but it's incredibly delicious when slow braised. This dish involved slow cooking skirt steak until it became tender and succulent. The steak was typically braised with vegetables like onions, carrots, and celery, along with a rich broth or wine to enhance its flavor. Skirt steak is also traditional in Mexican cuisine, particularly in the north where it is known as arrachera. Braised skirt steak was often served with mashed potatoes or crusty bread to soak up the delicious sauce. This dish was a hit at sophisticated restaurants, but that doesn't mean your grandma couldn't whip it up. They're the best chefs after all. Go dust off some old cookbooks and you'll find a traditional recipe that won't disappoint. It's still a dish that's perfect for a cozy night in, a family gathering, or simply when you crave a warm and comforting meal. Corn chowder is pretty much something you can link right back to all the indigenous peoples that were populating America before European settlers had to rain on their parade. Corn was such a staple crop that it could be mixed and thrown into so many different kinds of stews and milk. A lot of those settlers stole indigenous techniques and methods of cooking corn, passing it off as their own. One of them was how they combined corn with milk and created this very rich chowder, also with a bit of cream on the side for consistency. Chowder itself actually used to be something people would cook in a cauldron, if you can believe it or not. When those settlers did come, they first took residence up in New England, which, well, is definitely a European thing to do. They adapted corn chowder, as by that point they were pretty much relying on basic foods and ingredients to get them by. Later on, corn saw an extreme amount of use throughout the Depression and War era. But I think all of its tenured history has left the American population a bit tired of it. Venison stew is a hearty, outdoorsy classic that transforms lean game meat into a warm, comforting meal. Imagine tender chunks of venison simmered in a savory, rich broth alongside carrots, potatoes, onions, and a blend of earthy herbs. Venison's natural, slightly sweet flavor shines in this dish, complemented beautifully by a splash of red wine or dark beer for extra depth. And here's the best part. Venison stew is for the adventurers, the hunters, or anyone wanting to shake up their winter dinner routine with something special. Venison isn't your everyday meat. It's low in fat but packed with protein, making it a perfect choice if you want a hearty meal that won't weigh you down. The key to a great venison stew? Letting it cook low and slow to bring out the meat's tender, luxurious texture. Fun fact: in medieval Europe, venison was so prized that only the nobility could legally hunt it, so this stew comes with a touch of gourmet history. Toss in a few juniper berries or bay leaves for a rustic, woodsy note, and don't forget a crusty baguette to soak up every last drop of that rich, flavorful broth. Ideal for sharing around a fire, real or imagined. Venison stew is wholesome, warming, and brings a taste of the wild right to your table. Speaking of how different things were in their time due to the economical strife, one thing that got really popular back when your grandparents were still young was sausage gravy and biscuits. This might seem like an outlandish combo to us today, and we admit it takes a bit of getting used to, but the magic is all in the gravy. Biscuits and gravy are already something Americans have been pretty accustomed to eating, especially in the 20th century, but innovation is one of the finer points of the country, and culinary matters are no exception. People eventually found out that using pork sausage crumbles enriched the gravy and made it irresistible, especially if they were smoked. Usually biscuits like jumbo buttermilk ones make for a great side to the dish, but even the gravy alone was worth eating on its own. Okay, this one might seem strange to modern plates, but mock turtle soup was once a luxurious and popular dish. It is an English soup that was created in the mid-18th century as an imitation of green turtle soup. It often used brains and organ meats, such as calf's head, to duplicate the texture and flavor of the original turtle meat after the green turtles used to make the original dish were hunted nearly to extinction. Now, before you wrinkle your nose, mock turtle soup was a staple at Victorian dinner tables. The original version is a bit off-putting, but nothing wrong with calf meat, right? In the United States, mock turtle soup eventually became more popular than the original dish and is still popular in Cincinnati. Of course, as turtles became more and more extinct, so did this dish that tried imitating their taste in a soup. But hey, it could be reinterpreted with plant-based alternatives for a delicious and cruelty-free twist on this classic winter soup. Cabbage soup, on the other hand, has some really deep-rooted origins in European culture. This time, this is something they introduced into the country instead of something they stole. Cabbage was such a readily available crop that was filled with endless amounts of health benefits. In medieval Europe, lots of people used stews and cabbage soups as a way to survive in harsh winters and pass them by. As far as peasant food went, you couldn't get more authentic than this. That was also because a lot of peasant food revolved around cooking things you could make on an open fire or just did not need a lot of kitchen appliances for. The simple act of boiling cabbage with some root vegetables and occasionally garlic and meat, or doing a calm little bone broth with it, became a symbol of peasant eating and showed lots of people the vast amounts of potential cabbages really had. Still, plain foods aren't really something America identifies with too strongly, and that's why this got left behind. Mulligan stew is typically a leftover dish, and indeed, it is the definition of throwing together everything except for the kitchen sink. It has its roots in the Great Depression when individuals combined all sorts of commodities that were edible in a pot: meat, vegetables, beans, pasta, and anything that could be imagined. Thus, no two Mulligan stews are the same. It is one of the most versatile, or rather, one of the most lenient, dishes to prepare. Mulligan stew is based on what is known as the hobo stew, in which you subject various ingredients to uncertain fates that result in an amazing stew. The factor that makes Mulligan stew stand out is the fact that it is one of the cheapest meals that can be prepared. Got leftover beef? Toss it in. An extra can of beans? Throw it in too. This consists of potatoes, carrots, onions, tomatoes, some appetizers, and whatever remains in the kitchen. In the Great Depression, massive quantities of Mulligan stew would be cooked in large batches, and everyone would bring something to the kettle. This sharing and utilization of every little component is the essence of Mulligan stew. Oh, no preparations here. Simply use your creativity. To give it a boost, season with a hint of Worcestershire, or alternatively, season with a pinch of paprika. So the next time you find your fridge is almost empty, then maybe it is time to bring out the Depression-era chef in you and try out Mulligan stew. It is the stew equivalent of the Mystery Box Challenge and will surely warm you. Let us know if these winter dishes were a household item for your grandparents back in the day in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe while doing that.